Can you imagine the moment when everything you thought was permanent suddenly becomes temporary? When the walls that have sheltered your children, the roof that has kept them dry, the address on mail that says home, all of it disappears in the span of a single afternoon. That's what happened to Catherine Wells on a Tuesday in March, when her husband's business partner showed up at her door with a lawsuit and a smile that contained no kindness. Catherine was 42 years old when she became invisible. That's what widowhood meant in the small town of Millbrook, not the loss of a spouse, but the loss of standing, the loss of voice, the loss of the right to occupy space without explanation. Her husband David had been dead for 14 months. A heart attack in the parking lot of a grocery store. She'd held his cold hand in the hospital room and watched the machine that was keeping him alive flatline, and then she'd learned the truth. David had been bankrupt for 3 years. The house, the car, the college funds he'd promised their children, all of it was collateral in deals he'd made and failed to honor. The partner, a man named Graves with the eyes of a vulture, had been patient. He'd given her time to grieve. 6 months, then he'd come for what was owed. Catherine had 3 children. Sophie was 17, already looking at colleges she would never be able to afford. Marcus was 14 and still believed the world operated on fairness. And little Emma, only 6 years old, still asked when Daddy was coming home from work. The house sells in 30 days, Graves had said, his voice smooth as oil over poison. You'll have enough left over to rent something modest. I'm being generous, Mrs. Wells. The amount David owed could have taken much more. She'd packed their lives into boxes, labeled them, watched them get taped shut as if that could seal away the humiliation of having nowhere to go. The rental market in Millbrook was brutal. Nobody wanted to rent to a widow with 3 children and a part-time job at a community center. The applications came back marked insufficient income, or sometimes just silence, the particular silence of people who don't want to explain their cruelty. She looked at apartments in the neighboring towns. Nothing she could afford. Nothing that wouldn't swallow the last of her savings within 3 months. It was Mrs. Chen, who worked the information desk at the community center, who mentioned the Holloway property. It's been empty for 5 years, Mrs. Chen had said, lowering her voice as if discussing something scandalous. The owner's in a nursing home, dementia, no one to maintain it. The property taxes are in arrears. If you could contact the conservator. What's wrong with it? Catherine had asked, because everything Mrs. Chen was describing sounded too convenient, and convenient wasn't something that happened to people like her anymore. Mrs. Chen had hesitated. That hesitation meant something. It meant she was about to deliver bad news but wanted to let Catherine down gently. It's the Holloway place on Ravenhill Road. People say. Mrs. Chen had trailed off, uncomfortable. Well, there was a death there. 20 years ago. A girl, a teenager. She drowned in the creek behind the house, but some people say she didn't drown. They say she was locked in the basement during a storm and she drowned when the water came in. The death was ruled accidental, but nobody lives there. Catherine had finished. Nobody lives there, Mrs. Chen had confirmed. It had taken 3 weeks to track down the conservator. 3 weeks of phone calls and paperwork and a lawyer she couldn't afford but hired anyway. The house had been available for a lease-to-own arrangement, the conservator had explained. The owner wanted the property maintained. Regular lease payments could eventually be credited toward purchase. It was unusual, but the owner's family was interested in someone actually caring for the place. The house was old, built in 1924, according to the records. Victorian style, 3 stories, set back from the road on a sprawling property that had once been landscaped, but was now gone wild with neglect. The paint was faded to a color between gray and white. The shutters hung at odd angles. There was a turret on one corner that had cracked glass windows, and the front porch sagged in the middle like the house was bowing in defeat. Catherine had stood in the driveway with her 3 children and felt the weight of what she was about to do settle on her. Shoulders like snow. Sophie had wrinkled her nose. It looks haunted. It's not haunted, Catherine had said firmly, but she wasn't thinking about ghosts. She was thinking about Elizabeth Holloway, the girl who'd drowned 20 years ago. She was thinking about how every town had a story like this. A girl who'd disappeared, a death that didn't quite make sense, a mystery that had calcified into legend over decades. The inside was worse than the outside. Dust had settled on surfaces like snow that had never melted. The furniture was old and broken, Furniture from decades past that had been left behind because it wasn't worth moving. Wallpaper peeled from the walls in strips like the house itself was shedding skin. There was a smell, musty and old, and something else underneath it. Something Catherine couldn't quite name, but that made the back of her neck tighten. "I'm not staying here," Marcus had said. He was at the age where rebellion was becoming his default response to disappointment, and he had plenty of disappointment to rebel against. "We don't have another choice," Catherine had replied, and those words had come out harder than she intended. But they were true. They didn't have to do anything. This was it. This was the bottom. And the only direction from the bottom was up. They'd started cleaning. That first week, they'd thrown out enough to fill 3 dumpsters. Broken furniture, ruined carpet, clothing that had rotted in closets, dishes that had crusted over and then gone hard as concrete. Layer by layer, they'd excavated the house, and with each layer came the feeling that they were uncovering a crime scene. Catherine worked nights at the community center and days in the house. She'd fall asleep at the dinner table. She'd wake up in the darkness of her new bedroom, a room that still smelled like mold despite hours of bleaching, and lie awake listening to the house settle and shift around her. The sounds of old wood complaining, of pipes carrying water through ancient veins. The neighbors didn't visit. Nobody brought casseroles the way they might have for a widow in grief. This widow was different. This widow had made a choice that marked her as other. Living in the Holloway house meant you were desperate or foolish or both. There were whispers at the grocery store. Catherine caught fragments of them. The widow in the Holloway house. Heard she's lost her mind. Moving into a place like that with 3 children. What kind of mother? She'd stopped going to the town library because the librarian's eyes held too much pity, the kind that tipped over into judgment. She'd stopped attending the church she'd belonged to for 15 years because the pastor had called her brave in a way that made it clear he meant foolish. She'd become a ghost herself, moving through town with her children, acknowledged, but not quite seen. 6 weeks after they moved in, Catherine was deep cleaning the parlor when Emma called out from the hallway. "Mommy, there's a door!" Catherine had climbed down from the stepladder where she'd been scrubbing the ceiling and found her youngest standing in front of a door that opened onto darkness. "That's a closet, honey," Catherine had said, moving to close it. But it wasn't a closet. Behind the door was a staircase, wooden and steep, descending into a darkness that seemed to have substance, as if the air itself had been compressed and hardened into black. Catherine's heart had begun to race for no reason she could articulate. The basement. Of course the house had a basement. Most old houses did, but for some reason she'd avoided looking for one. For some reason, she'd been content to pretend that the ground floor was the lowest level of the house, that there was nothing beneath her feet but earth and the weight of history. She'd gotten a flashlight. She'd told Emma to stay upstairs with Marcus. She'd descended. The basement was vast, running almost the entire length and width of the house. The walls were stone, sweating with moisture. There were pipes and old furnaces and tangles of wiring that belonged to decades past. There were boxes, countless boxes, stacked along one wall, their labels faded beyond reading. Some of them had been opened and then hastily resealed, as if someone had searched through them and then thought better of it, and there was a door. A heavy metal door, like something from a vault, set into the far wall. It was padlocked. The lock was old, oxidized orange with rust. But there was something else. Scratches around the lock, fresh scratches made within the last few years. Someone had tried to open this door, recently. Catherine approached it slowly. Her mind was making connections she didn't want it to make. This door, this basement? A girl who had drowned. A story that had never quite made sense. Fresh scratches on an old lock. She'd turned the lock over in her mind. It wasn't locked with the kind of lock you could force. It was the kind of lock that spoke to secrets, to things that were meant to stay hidden. The kind of lock that was reinforced, deliberately, to keep something in or to keep someone out. She'd gone back upstairs and found a ledger in the kitchen, tucked behind a loose board. It was filled with dates and notations. The most recent entry was from 3 months ago. Fix the lock again. He asked too many questions. Must increase the security. Catherine's blood had gone cold. The handwriting was different from what she'd seen in the house's previous records. It was recent. It was active. Someone had been maintaining this lock. Someone had been actively keeping whatever was in that vault secured. That night, after the children were asleep, Catherine had gone back to the basement. She'd taken a hammer. She'd swung it against the lock, not hard enough to cause permanent damage, just enough to test the strength of it. The lock had held. She'd swung again, and again. On the fourth swing, the padlock had shattered. The door had swung inward on hinges that screamed in protest, and beneath the sound of those hinges was something else. The smell that hit her was wrong. It was too fresh to be old, too organic, too present. Catherine had raised her flashlight and stepped into the darkness. The small room beyond was maybe 8 feet by 8 feet. The walls were concrete, newer than the rest of the basement, added within the last decade by the look of them. There was a cot, old and stained. There were empty water bottles, dozens of them scattered across the floor. There was a bucket in the corner that made Catherine's stomach turn. And on the cot, curled in a position that suggested both exhaustion and terror, was a boy. He was maybe 12 or 13 years old. His skin was paper white. His hair was long and matted. He was wearing clothes so filthy they'd lost their color, become a uniform gray-brown. And he was awake. He was staring at Catherine with eyes so full of fear that she almost looked away. "Don't scream," the boy said. His voice was rough, unused to words. "Please don't scream." Catherine's first instinct was to run. Her second instinct was to protect her children. Her third instinct, the one that came after she forced herself to breathe and think, was to approach the boy slowly and ask him his name. His name was David. Not a coincidence that struck Catherine as particularly cruel until later. Right now, it was just a name belonging to a child who had clearly been held captive in her basement for an amount of time she couldn't yet comprehend. "How long?" she asked. "I don't know," the boy said. "The light doesn't change down here." I tried to count the meals. 3 meals a day, but sometimes I missed them. Sometimes I was sleeping. I think maybe 3 months, maybe more. 3 months. Catherine's mind reeled. 3 months and nobody had reported a missing child. 3 months and everyone in town was walking around living their lives as if nothing was wrong. She pulled out the ledger she'd found in the kitchen. "Is this him?" she asked, pointing to the most recent entries. The boy nodded slowly. "He says I'm his son. He says I'm defective. He says this is to fix me. He says when I'm better, when I learn to listen, when I stop being so disappointing, he'll let me out." Catherine felt something crystallize inside her. Anger so pure and sharp it was almost clarity. "Who is your real father?" Catherine asked. "I don't know," the boy said. "My mom was married to him. Then she wasn't. Then she met someone else. That person is the one who does this." Catherine understood. A stepfather, a man who'd installed himself into a family and then decided that one of the children didn't fit. One of the children was the problem. One of the children needed to be fixed. "Your real mother," Catherine said carefully. "Do you remember her name?" The boy's face crumpled. "Ellen. Her name is Ellen. She was nice, but he said she was making me soft. He said she was the reason I was defective. So he took me. He said it was just for a weekend. He said it was a special father-son trip. But we came here and we went down and the boy trailed off. He pulled up his sleeve and Catherine saw welts, rope marks, bruises in the shape of hands. She didn't think. She acted. She got the boy water. She brought him blankets from upstairs. She got him dressed in clean clothes from Marcus's drawer. Although they were too large and made him look even younger, even more fragile. "I have to call someone," Catherine said. "No," the boy said immediately, panic flashing across his face. "No, you can't. He'll know. He'll say I betrayed him. He'll come back angrier. He always comes back when he's angry." Catherine understood what the unsaid words meant. She'd heard that story in her work at the community center. She'd heard it from other women, other children. The cycle of escalation, the way violence fed on itself, the way a secret, once revealed, could trigger a catastrophe. But she also understood that silence was its own catastrophe. She climbed the stairs and stood in her kitchen and held the phone in her hand and thought about consequences. She thought about what would happen if she called the police. The investigation, the questions, the revelation that she'd been living in the house with this secret in her basement, the way people would assume the worst about her, the way this town already assumed the worst about her. She thought about what would happen if she didn't call, if she kept the boy hidden, if she protected him here, in this house that everyone avoided, where nobody looked too closely, where a widow living alone with her children could hide another child in plain sight. She could feed him. She could heal him. She could let time pass and hope that the stepfather forgot. She could keep him until he was old enough to disappear on his own. She could also be complicit in his father's crimes. Every day she didn't report, every meal she served him, every time she changed the bandages on his wounds without calling for help, she would be choosing the stepfather's power over the boy's freedom. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, 17 years old and already too perceptive for her own good. "Mom, what's wrong? You look like you're going to be sick." Catherine set the phone down. "Get your brother and sister quietly. Bring them to the kitchen. Don't ask questions." When all three of her children were gathered, confused, frightened by the tone in her voice, Catherine told them about the boy in the basement. "We have to call the police," Sophie said immediately. It was the response of someone who still believed the world worked the way it was supposed to. "We do," Catherine agreed. "But I need you to understand something. When we do this, everything changes. The police will come. Investigators will come. This house will become part of an investigation. People will talk. People will wonder if I knew. People will wonder if I kept him hidden. Our lives will stop being private. My life isn't private anyway," Marcus said bitterly. "Nobody talks to me. Nobody wants to be friends with the kid whose dad was a thief." "That's not fair," Emma said, not understanding but sensing that something important was happening. "Life isn't fair," Catherine said, "but we can choose what we do with the unfairness we're given. That boy has been tortured. If we stay silent, we're part of that torture. So we're not going to stay silent. We're going to call the police, and then we're going to answer every question they ask us. And we're going to tell the truth." She picked up the phone. She dialed 911. She reported a child held captive at the Holloway house on Ravenhill Road. The police arrived within 15 minutes. Then came investigators. Then came social services. Then came news vans with their satellites and their cameras, and the small town of Millbrook suddenly became the center of the world's attention. But the stepfather was not home. They found him 3 days later in a motel 6 towns over, with a second boy in his room. A different boy, younger, more recent. The police discovered that he'd been doing this for 8 years. 8 years and multiple boys. 8 years and no one had reported him because the boys had no one to report to. No one who cared. No one who was looking. The stepfather was arrested at the motel, and during the arrest, he'd made a mistake. He'd resisted. He'd fought with the officers. In the struggle, he'd fallen down a flight of stairs, hard enough that he'd broken his spine in 3 places. He was paralyzed from the waist down. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who'd imprisoned children in dark rooms was now imprisoned in a wheelchair, in a cell for the rest of his life. The boy, David, was taken to a hospital, where doctors examined him and found evidence of systematic abuse spanning not 3 months, but almost 2 years. He'd been moved around, kept in different places, different rooms, different basements. The Holloway house was just the latest location in a geography of cruelty, and the second boy revealed a network. There were other families involved, other adults who'd known, other towns, other houses. What had seemed like an isolated incident unraveled into something much larger, much darker. The investigation branched out, reached into neighboring states, connected with federal authorities. Catherine became something she'd never expected to become, a hero. But not in the way she would have wanted. The narrative was irresistible. The widow living in the haunted house. The lonely house that everyone avoided. The boy hidden in the darkness. The mother who'd found him and immediately done the right thing. News outlets ran with it. Social media exploded. A documentary filmmaker reached out. A book publisher wanted her story. Catherine did interviews that she immediately regretted. She gave statements that felt like betrayals of nuance, of the complexity of the choice she'd made. She watched as the story simplified, as her hesitation was edited out, as the difficult parts, the moments where she'd considered silence, were removed in favor of a cleaner narrative. Sophie watched the news coverage and said, "They're making it like you're a saint. They're making it like you didn't even have to think about it." "I did have to think about it," Catherine said quietly. That's the part they don't want to know. The trial happened 6 months later. The boy, his name was actually Michael, though everyone had called him David because his stepfather had renamed him, testified about the abuse. Michael's mother, who'd divorced the father years ago but had never believed Michael's stories of abuse, cried in the courtroom, and apologized for her disbelief. She'd thought her son was exaggerating. She'd thought he was seeking attention. She'd chosen to believe the stepfather over her own child. The second boy testified. Then investigators testified about the other boys, other locations, other pieces of evidence that had emerged during the investigation. During the trial, it was revealed that Elizabeth Holloway, the girl who'd drowned 20 years ago, had spent time in the Holloway house basement. Not in a vault room like Michael, but in the basement itself during a flood. Her body had never been recovered, but investigators found evidence that she'd been there, that the drowning story had been partially true, but that there was more to it. The house had a history of secrets and darkness that went back decades. Catherine sat in the gallery and watched justice unfold, and she felt nothing but exhaustion, because the truth was more complicated than the narrative. The truth was that she'd considered keeping Michael's presence secret. The truth was that she'd weighed her own comfort against his suffering, and had only chosen correctly because she had children of her own who'd needed her to choose correctly. The truth was that if she'd been alone, if there'd been no witnesses to her decision, she might have made a different choice. That knowledge lived inside her like a second basement, a hidden room she couldn't quite lock up. The town's attitude toward her shifted overnight. The whispers changed from whispers of judgment to whispers of admiration. People who'd avoided her now sought her out. They brought casseroles, after all. They invited her to events. They told her she was brave and noble and kind, and Catherine felt suffocated by their approval. But something else was happening beneath the surface of the investigation. As the federal authorities dug deeper into the network, they discovered that the Holloway house had been used multiple times over multiple decades. The basement had been renovated before Michael was imprisoned there. It had been renovated before Elizabeth Holloway had drowned. The house had been a location of abuse going back to at least the 1960s, and there was a connection. The original Holloway family had sold the house in 1985 after Elizabeth's death. The new owners had lived there only briefly before leaving. Since then, there had been a pattern. The house would be rented or purchased by someone. They would use it for a few months or a few years, and then they would disappear. The properties would go into foreclosure. The houses would sit empty. Someone was using these houses. Someone was using them deliberately, moving them through a network of people. Someone was buying and selling properties specifically to create private spaces where abuse could happen with minimal oversight. The FBI got involved. They discovered a ring. Not a small operation, a coordinated network of people who'd been using abandoned properties across a dozen states to hold children captive. The Holloway house was just one node in a much larger web. Catherine received a call from a special agent named Morrison. "Mrs. Wells," he said, "your discovery has exposed something much larger than we initially thought. The stepfather was working as part of an operation. We believe there are at least 43 children involved over the past 15 years. We're still finding properties. We're still finding evidence. 43 children." Catherine felt the weight of that number. 43 lives disrupted. 43 stories that would take decades to untangle. 43 children who, like Michael, had spent time in basements and vaults and locked rooms, waiting for someone to find them. 2 years passed. Michael was placed with his mother, who'd finally learned to see him, to hear him, to believe him. But the process of healing was not linear. Michael had nightmares. He had violent outbursts. He had moments where the world seemed too bright, too loud, too open, and he would retreat into silence. His mother learned the language of trauma. She learned to hold her son without trying to fix him immediately. Sophie went to college on the scholarship that materialized after the story became national news. She studied criminal justice. She volunteered at victim advocacy centers. Marcus started playing guitar and found a community of people who didn't care about his father's bankruptcy. Emma remained Emma, untouched by the darkness because Catherine had protected her from it, and the Holloway house became Catherine's home. She'd finally completed the lease-to-own transaction and owned it outright. She'd had the basement renovated. She'd removed the vault door, had it taken off and destroyed. She'd filled the small room with light and turned it into a library, shelves of books reaching up to the ceiling, a space meant for reading and thinking and allowing the past to transform into something other than trauma. But Catherine didn't forget about the deeper mystery. She didn't forget about the network. She didn't forget that there were still missing pieces. She reached out to the FBI. She asked to be involved in the investigation. She offered to let them interview her about the house, about the basement, about anything that might help them understand how these properties were being used. Agent Morrison hesitated. "This could be dangerous, Mrs. Wells. These people, they're protective of their operations. They don't like exposure." "I know," Catherine said, "but Michael is safe now. And if my house can help find other children, then my house needs to be used that way." The investigation that followed revealed that the network wasn't just coordinated, it was deliberate. There were people buying up properties specifically for this purpose. There were people in real estate, people in local government, people in law enforcement who were part of the operation, or at least complicit in it. One of those people was the current police chief in Millbrook. His name was Richard Holloway, the same last name as the house, as Elizabeth Holloway, the girl who'd drowned 20 years ago. Catherine's hands went cold when she read the report. She pulled out the old records about Elizabeth. The girl had been 12 when she drowned. The death had been ruled accidental, the result of a basement flooding during a storm. But there had been questions. There had been witnesses who'd said things didn't add up. There had been a father who'd disappeared shortly after the death. A family that had scattered. Richard Holloway was Elizabeth's uncle. Catherine called Agent Morrison. "I think I found something," she said. "I think Elizabeth Holloway's death wasn't accidental. I think it was part of this." What followed was a year-long investigation that peeled back layers of the town's history. Elizabeth Holloway had been abused. She'd been kept in the basement. She'd tried to escape during a storm, had tried to run to a neighbor's house, and had been caught by her uncle in the flooding creek. Whether she'd drowned accidentally or been deliberately held underwater, that question would never be answered definitively, but the evidence suggested intent. Her death had been covered up by the family. Her death had been covered up by local authorities, including her uncle Richard, who'd been a police officer at the time. Her death had been buried under layers of secrecy and lies, and her death had somehow set in motion the idea that the Holloway house could be used for this purpose. That family legacy of abuse had become something else, a deliberate operation. Richard Holloway was arrested. He was convicted. He took a plea deal rather than face trial, admitting to being part of the network, admitting to knowledge of Elizabeth's death, admitting to 3 decades of complicity and abuse. The town of Millbrook had to confront what it had become, had to confront how many of its institutions had been corrupted, had to confront how many times people had known and said nothing. Catherine didn't think about the Holloway house as a place of evil anymore. She thought about it as a place of revelation, a place where secrets couldn't stay buried, a place where the truth, no matter how dark, had to eventually come out. She turned the house into something more than just a home. She worked with the FBI and with survivor advocacy groups to create a memorial space. The basement became a museum of sorts, not exploitative, but honest. It told the story of what had happened there. It told the stories of the children who'd been held captive. It honored Elizabeth Holloway and the 43 other children whose lives had been marked by the network's cruelty. But creating that space hadn't been simple. Catherine had spent months wrestling with the ethics of it. Should a place of trauma be turned into a place of remembrance? Would that honor the survivors or exploit them? Would displaying their stories respect their privacy or violate it further? She'd consulted with Michael, with the other survivors, with psychologists who specialized in trauma. They'd helped her understand that transformation didn't mean pretending the harm hadn't happened. It meant creating a space where the harm could be acknowledged, where the stories could be told by those who'd lived them, where visitors could learn not just what had happened, but why it had been allowed to happen. The museum occupied only a portion of the basement. The rest became office space for Sophie's nonprofit. The upper floors became living quarters. The house held within it both memorial and sanctuary, both witness and refuge, and the house became a destination. Survivors from other networks came to see it. Researchers came to study it. Journalists came to report on it. The Holloway house on Raven Hill Road became known across the country as a place where darkness had been transformed into light, where a community had confronted its complicity and chosen differently. But with that transformation came complications that Catherine hadn't anticipated. 3 years into the transformation, Catherine received a letter. It was from Elizabeth Holloway's father, or rather, from the man who'd been married to Elizabeth's mother. He'd served his sentence for his role in Elizabeth's death. He'd been released on parole and was writing to Catherine from a halfway house in another state. The letter was short but devastating. Mrs. Wells, I've been following what you've done with my family's house. I've read about the memorial. I've read about how you've made it a place of healing. I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry. Not for what I did. I've made peace with that in my own way, but for what I couldn't stop. For what I enabled. For the part of me that, even now, doesn't fully understand why I did what I did. My daughter is dead because of choices I made. Choices I won't ask for forgiveness for, because there is no forgiveness adequate to the harm I caused. But I wanted you to know that you're right. The house remembers. The house holds the truth. And sometimes truth is the only mercy we can offer. I hope someday I can visit what you've created. But I understand if that day never comes. Catherine had shown the letter to Sophie, who'd said, "Don't let him." "Why not?" Catherine had asked. "Because survivors shouldn't have to heal in front of the people who hurt them," Sophie had said. "Because his remorse, however genuine, isn't your responsibility to accept or validate." Catherine had understood. She'd written back to the man not a letter of forgiveness, but a letter of clarity. She'd told him that he was welcome to contribute financially to the memorial. She'd told him he was welcome to participate in a restorative justice process that brought together perpetrators and survivors. But she'd told him that his presence in the physical space, in the house, would not be permitted. That boundary had to be maintained. It was the first time Catherine understood that transformation didn't mean erasing boundaries. It meant building new ones, stronger ones, more intentional ones. But the letter had opened a question that Catherine couldn't quite close. It was a question about forgiveness, about healing, about whether a place of trauma could ever be fully healed, or whether the healing was always contingent, always incomplete, always at risk of being disrupted by the reemergence of the past. 5 years into Catherine's time at the house, new evidence emerged. Not about the network in general, but about how the network had sustained itself. Investigators discovered financial records. They discovered that certain real estate companies had been deliberately selling properties to people they knew were part of the network. They discovered that certain banks had been deliberately looking the other way when mortgage payments came from shell companies. More arrests followed. More trials. More revelations about how systemic the complicity had been. It wasn't just individuals making bad choices. It was institutions. It was systems. It was the deliberate creation of spaces where harm could happen because it was profitable. One of the people arrested was a real estate agent named Patricia Hollis. She'd been the one who'd handled the sale of the Holloway house originally, back when it went into foreclosure after Elizabeth's death. She'd been the one who'd, allegedly, connected the property with people in the network. Patricia had been 72 years old when she was arrested. She'd built a successful business. She'd been a respected member of her community, and she'd deliberately sold properties to people she believed would abuse children in them. Her motivation, investigators discovered, wasn't financial. While not primarily, Patricia had been abused as a child. She'd survived her own trauma. And somewhere along the way, her survival had twisted into something else. She'd begun to see abuse not as something to prevent, but as something inevitable. She'd begun to see herself not as a survivor, but as an executor of a cosmic pattern. Catherine read about this revelation and felt something shift inside her. All this time, she'd been thinking about perpetrators as fundamentally different from survivors. But Patricia Hollis had been both. Her trauma had made her cruel. Her survival had twisted into complicity. It was a truth Catherine wasn't ready to confront. That the line between victim and perpetrator could blur. That survival didn't automatically make you good. That the hurt could hurt others. Lisa had been living in the Holloway house for 3 years when another woman arrived at the door. Her name was Rebecca, and she had no children, no savings, no family. She'd been living in her car. She'd been working 2 jobs and still couldn't afford rent. She'd heard about the Holloway house from a social worker. She'd heard that it was a place where women like her, desperate, broken, alone, could find refuge. Catherine had welcomed her. This was, after all, what the house was for. But Rebecca had brought something else with her. She'd brought a question that Catherine couldn't answer. "Why should I trust you?" Rebecca had asked on her 3rd day. "You saved that boy. You did the right thing. But what if you'd decided not to? What if you decided to keep him hidden? What if you'd decided that your own safety was more important? Would you have been a bad person? Yes, Catherine had said immediately. But you're not a bad person, Rebecca had said. So the difference between you and a bad person is just a choice, just timing, just circumstance. That terrifies me. That makes me wonder if I could be standing on the other side of that choice and not even know it. Catherine had sat with that question for a long time. It was the question that kept her awake at night now, more than the nightmares about the basement, more than the memories of finding Michael in the dark. It was the question of moral contingency, of how close we all are to making the wrong choice, of how fragile civilization is if it depends on individual people making the right decision at the right moment. 7 years after Catherine first heard the cry from the basement, a new investigation began. This one was different. This one wasn't about the network or the corruption. This one was about the houses themselves. Researchers wanted to understand how certain properties seemed to attract abuse, how certain locations seemed to have patterns of harm. They worked with historians and criminologists and sociologists, and what they discovered was that there was no mystical connection. There was no supernatural element. What they found instead was something more human and more troubling. Real estate agents who knew about the network. Landlords who didn't ask questions. Communities that turned away people who seemed different or problematic, creating a space where abusers could operate. The Holloway House became a case study, not in the supernatural, but in the way communities enable abuse through willful blindness, and Catherine became something she never expected to become. Not just a victim of circumstance, but a researcher. She worked with the university. She took classes. She learned statistics and methodology. She learned how to conduct interviews with trauma survivors in ways that honored their experiences. She learned how to write academic papers without sanitizing the horror or sensationalizing the suffering. She published her first paper at age 49. It was titled, Silent Walls: How Communities Construct the Conditions for Abuse. She argued that abuse wasn't random, that abusers didn't emerge from nowhere, that communities, by consistently punishing the vulnerable and protecting the powerful, created the conditions where abuse could flourish. She argued that transformation required not just individual heroism, but systemic change. The paper was downloaded 5,000 times in its first month. Universities asked her to speak. Advocacy groups invited her to consult with them. She became the voice that explained how communities could transform themselves, how silence could be interrupted, how the curse of complicity could be broken through the simple act of refusing to look away. By the time Catherine turned 50, the Holloway House had become something none of them had anticipated. It had become a network node. Survivors from other cases, women and children who'd escaped abuse in other locations, began finding their way to it. Some came for days. Some came for months. Some came for years. The house had grown beyond its physical walls. Sophie had opened additional shelters in 3 other towns. Marcus had started a music therapy program that was replicated in 12 different cities. Emma, now an adult, had become a counselor specializing in trauma. But Michael remained at the center of it all. He was an adult now, 27 years old, and he'd become the house's historian. He gave tours of the memorial space. He told his story to survivors and to researchers and to journalists. He'd written his own book about his experience, about the network, about the journey from captivity to freedom. In his acknowledgments, he'd written about Catherine to Catherine Wells. You heard my cry from the basement and answered it. You risked your own stability to protect me. You transformed a place of horror into a place of hope. But more than that, you taught me that survival isn't about individual heroism. It's about choosing to see each other. It's about refusing to look away. It's about understanding that we're all implicated in systems of harm unless we actively choose not to be. Reading those words had made Catherine cry. Not happy tears, not sad tears, but tears that contained both, tears that acknowledged the complexity of what they'd built together. 10 years after Catherine moved into the Holloway House, the town of Millbrook held a commemoration event. It was both a celebration and a reckoning. It celebrated the survivors. It acknowledged the town's complicity. It recognized that the work of transformation was ongoing, would always be ongoing, would never truly be complete. Catherine was asked to speak. She stood in front of the house with Sophie and Marcus and Emma beside her, with Michael and Lisa and Rebecca and dozens of other women and survivors in the audience, and she said, I moved into this house because I was desperate. I had nowhere else to go. I didn't know what I would find here. I didn't know that in the basement, beneath the concrete and the rust, there was a boy screaming for help. I didn't know that this house held secrets spanning decades. I didn't know that my choice to answer that cry would change not just my life, but the lives of hundreds of people. But I want to tell you something that the news stories left out. I want to tell you about the moment when I held the phone and thought about not calling the police. I want to tell you about the moment when I considered keeping Michael hidden. I want to tell you that I almost chose differently, that I almost became complicit in his suffering. The only reason I didn't is because I had 3 children who were watching me, because I understood that the choice I made in that moment would teach them what kind of person to become, because I understood that my silence would cost him his life. But what about the woman without children? What about the woman so broken by her own suffering that she can't see someone else's? What about the man so trapped in his own needs that he can't hear another person's cry? We want to believe that we would choose correctly. We want to believe that we would always answer the cry from the basement, but I can't promise that. I can't promise that about myself. All I can promise is that I'll keep trying, that I'll keep listening, that I'll keep refusing to let darkness have the final word. And I ask the same of you. Not heroism, not perfection, just the willingness to see, the willingness to listen, the willingness to act when you can, the willingness to admit when you can't, and to find someone who can. That night, after the commemorative event, the survivors and the staff and the family gathered in the library, in what had been the vault room, the place of secrets and suffering. They sat in a circle. They didn't speak for a long time. They just sat with each other, in the space where darkness had been transformed into light. Michael was the first to speak. "I don't think I would be alive if Mrs. Wells hadn't called the police," he said. "I don't think I would have survived another month down there." The despair was becoming. I was starting to plan how I would end it, how I would use the belt I wore, the laces from my shoes. I was counting the ways I could make it permanent.
And then Catherine opened that door. Rebecca said, "I was in my car."
I was about to use the pills I'd saved. I was about to end my own suffering because I couldn't imagine it ever changing. And I read about this house. I read about what Catherine had built. And I thought maybe I could wait one more day. And that one day became a week. A week became a month. And now I can't imagine being anywhere else. Lisa said, "I came here as a widow. I came here broken." And Catherine took me in without questions. She gave me and my daughter a place to belong. She showed me that survival was possible. She showed me that the world wasn't entirely cruel. Sophie said, "I watched my mother find a stranger in the basement and choose to save him instead of protecting her own children first." It was the moment I understood that love isn't about hierarchy. It's about choosing to see everyone as worthy of protection. That changed everything I believe about being human. Marcus said, "I watched my mother transform a place of horror into something beautiful. I watched her do it without pretending the horror had never existed. I watched her hold both things at the same time, the memory of the darkness and the reality of the light. That's when I understood what real strength looks like." Emma said, "I was too young to understand what was happening. But I remember feeling safe even when everything was scary. I remember my mother's hands on my head, keeping me from seeing things that would break me. I remember understanding that love is sometimes about blocking the view, sometimes about protecting innocence. And then I grew up and learned what had been behind the things she was protecting me from, and I understood that her protection had been an act of courage, not weakness. And Catherine listened to all of them. She listened to the survivors speak about their journeys. She listened to the children speak about growing up in a house where trauma and healing existed side by side. She listened to the workers speak about the privilege of being part of something larger than themselves. When it was her turn to speak, Catherine found that she didn't know what to say. She'd spent 10 years trying to put words to what had happened. 10 years of interviews and papers and public speeches. 10 years of trying to explain how a widow desperate for housing had stumbled into a role she never asked for. "I came to this house looking for shelter," Catherine said finally. "I was invisible. I was rejected. I was marked as unsuitable. I came to this house because I had nowhere else to go. And in the darkness beneath this house, I found what I was actually looking for all along. Not a roof, not a home, but purpose. I found the understanding that my suffering wasn't meaningless, that it had prepared me to see someone else's suffering, that my desperation made me capable of recognizing desperation in others. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe that Elizabeth Holloway's spirit was calling to me, But I do believe that the house held memory, that the walls absorbed the suffering that happened within them. And I do believe that when I opened the door to the basement, when I chose to see Michael instead of look away, I was healing not just his trauma, but my own. I was transforming not just his basement, but my own. Catherine paused. She looked around the circle at the faces illuminated by lamplight. Faces that had been broken and were learning to be whole again. This house is no longer haunted, Catherine said. But it remembers. And I think that's what a sanctuary really is. Not a place where bad things never happened, but a place where bad things did happen and are now held with compassion. A place where the truth is told. A place where survivors come not to forget, but to be remembered. Catherine Wells was 62 years old when the documentary about her was released. It had taken 3 years to make. It featured interviews with Michael, with Sophie, with Marcus, with Emma, with Lisa, with Rebecca. It featured interviews with the FBI agents who'd investigated the network. It featured interviews with the other survivors, the ones who'd been recovered from the network's locations across multiple states. The documentary was called The Holloway House, How One Woman's Choice Changed Everything. It premiered at Sundance. It won awards. It was purchased by a streaming service and watched by millions of people around the world. But what Catherine was most proud of wasn't the documentary itself. It was what came after it. In the 6 months following the documentary's release, 32 new survivor shelters opened in different cities. Each one was based on the model of the Holloway House. Each one was run by survivors. Each one was dedicated to the principle that transformation meant holding both the memory of harm and the possibility of healing. Michael had become the director of a national network. He traveled to these shelters. He helped train the staff. He told his story in each location, making it clear that survival was possible, that recovery was possible, that the darkness didn't have to have the final word. Sophie's nonprofit had grown to employ over 200 people. Marcus's music had been featured in documentaries, in therapy sessions, in healing spaces. Emma had published a book about growing up in a house where trauma and healing existed side by side, and Catherine had become something she never expected to become, a symbol. Not of heroism, but of possibility. Not of perfection, but of the willingness to keep trying. Journalists asked her, "Don't you get tired? Don't you want to rest? Don't you want a normal life?" And Catherine would say, "This is a normal life. This is what being human looks like, seeing suffering and choosing to respond. That's not special. That's just the basic requirement of being part of a community that honors each other's lives." On a quiet evening, 15 years after she'd first opened the basement door and found Michael in the darkness, Catherine stood in the library, in what had been the vault of secrets, and looked at the spaces she'd created. She looked at the photographs on the walls. Elizabeth Holloway, Michael, the other survivors. The children born in these spaces, children who would never know the darkness because their parents had found refuge here. She thought about the moment when she'd held the phone and considered not calling. She thought about how close she'd come to making a different choice. She thought about all the other moments, all the other people, all the other times when someone had to decide whether to look away or to see. She thought about Patricia Hollis, the real estate agent, the survivor who'd become complicit in harm. She thought about the complexity of human nature, about how survival didn't automatically make you good, about how trauma could twist into cruelty if it wasn't met with compassion and accountability. And she thought about the future, about all the women who hadn't yet found their way to refuge, about all the children still hidden in basements, about all the communities still looking away. The work wasn't done. It would never be done. There would always be more suffering to witness, more choices to make, more moments when someone had to decide whether to hear the cry from the basement. But Catherine Wells, the widow who'd moved into the house everyone avoided, had learned something essential over the 15 years she'd lived there. She'd learned that transformation wasn't about erasing the past. It was about choosing again and again to honor the past while building something better. It was about understanding that the house held memory but didn't have to be imprisoned by it. It was about recognizing that every person, every survivor, every perpetrator, every bystander contained within them the capacity for both cruelty and kindness, and that the choice between them was made not once, but continually, in small moments and large ones. The Holloway House on Ravenhill Road was no longer the place where people whispered about tragedy and darkness. It was a sanctuary, It was a memorial. It was a home for those who'd lost everything. It was a school where people learned what it meant to see each other, to honor each other, to choose each other. And Catherine Wells, the invisible widow, the broken woman, the mother of three who'd stumbled into a role that would define her life, remained at its center, not as a hero, not as a savior, but as a witness. A woman who'd learned to see, a woman who'd learned to listen, a woman who, when she heard the cry from the basement, had answered it. And in answering, had transformed not just a house, but herself, and everyone whose life touched hers. That was the real story. That would always be the real story. Not the haunting, not the mystery, but the choosing. The continued, difficult, necessary choosing to see each other, to honor each other, to refuse to let darkness have the final word. The widow moved into the house everyone avoided. She expected to find only tragedy. Instead, she found a test of her own character. She found a reason to become who she wanted her children to become. And in becoming that person, she created a place where others could become who they wanted to become, where the broken could be healed, where the invisible could be seen, where the forgotten could be remembered. That is the story of the Holloway House. That is the story of Catherine Wells. That is a story that echoes still, in every survivor who's found refuge, in every child who's been protected, in every community that's chosen to see instead of look away. The cry from the basement has been answered. But the work of transformation continues, and somewhere in the world, another person is hearing a cry that only they can hear. The question for that person, for all of us, is simple. Will we answer it? That's the question that matters. That's the only question that ever really mattered.